like for this one, I feel like I have to put my head in a different space because I'm looking at it and I don't believe that about assessment. So it's really difficult to kind of go back and think about what our communities believe about assessment, our parents,
Right.
our system. This one might be the hardest one probably for me to do, but I think that definitely we should tackle it. I think that one thing that would be really helpful too is to even define like what we mean by assessment. So sometimes I feel like we talk about assessment as giving it. When I talk to teachers about assessment, I talk about it as assessment is the thing that teachers do. That's the thing that teachers do. Students do the task. The rubric is the tool to help us understand the evidence that students produce, but the assessment is the thing that teachers do. But the assessment is the understanding about the evidence. And so I think that's just important for folks to tease out in their head a little bit, especially when we're talking like when I give this assessment, we're really giving the student a task and I'm doing an assessment of the evidence that I received.
Hmm. We think of assessment. I mean, the dipstick is the metaphor that we have in our head for what is one metaphor that we have.
I like understand that one because I know how to check my oil, but dipsticks just has such a negative connotation. I actually think it's pretty simple.
Do you?
hmm I think we overcomplicate it, and it's really simple to just look at some evidence in front of you, make sense of it, and then report back what that sense making means to you.
Assessment tells you what a kid knows or can do. What I was getting at with that was this idea that assessment proves competency, and I was trying to get around to this idea that you have a body of evidence that tells a story instead of it just tells you yes or no. Do they know how to do this? Or do they not know how to do this?
That's an important one because assessments, especially standardized tests, really I don't think can tell you what a student can do because they're not doing anything but picking a number or letter. There's some thinking involved there. Perhaps you have some tasks like writing spontaneous essays, like you might do on an SAT or an AP exam, so you can get a little bit of understanding how they're thinking and then how they're interpreting that through their writing. But even again, I can't really understand necessarily the thinking if they can't translate that into writing. I might have a student who can write really well, but the thinking is limited. So it's limited in terms of standardized tests and us being able to put that up on a pedestal and say, hey, our students are proficient in math. And all they did was, multiple guess all the way through.
I feel like one of the themes of our writing is that it's possible for your understanding to be so limited that even if what you understand is true, it's so limited that your conclusions are false. You don't get a true picture of the kid. You're just getting such a tiny sliver of what they know or can do.
They're not honest. So if you give one task or you're giving a standardized task, I'm limiting in what they can show me that they can do. My dad, for example, is a good example. He in school would never have been able to pass a reading test, or maybe even a math test because of all the writing that was involved. But he can build stuff. He can create things, and he could do that. He does that mathematical and science thinking in his head, that physics thinking, but no one would ever know that he could do that because they didn't ask the right questions. And so it is really a dishonest thing when you're sort of pigeonholing all students to take one particular thing or assuming that this one particular thing is going to tell me what students know and can do. It is almost a lie by omission.
It reminds me, I just finished a Hank Green novel that my daughter gave me. One of the things he said was that humans create value, but we only notice the value that we can capture. but there's so much more that we don't capture, and learning how to notice that uh, would be a huge improvement. And I feel like the same thing applies here. It's like we have very limited ways of capturing what kids know and can do, but there's so much more that they know and can do.
And what we choose to capture, that's the story that we tell our students and our communities. So when you talk about value and we tell somebody, we captured this information about you and it says that you can't, it doesn't honor the things that they can do. And then so what does that do to someone's self-esteem, or what does that tell somebody about themselves?
So the next one is I wrote assignments are aligned to standards. That's a falsehood. So very often the alignment is so loose because people decide this needs to be our Civil War unit, and then they look for the standards that match up with the Civil War unit. And there's a very loose alignment. There's like a drive-by alignment.
I work in schools, and this has been the experience in my own school district when I was a teacher. How many people were on the committee? Who volunteered to be on the committee? So we were the gatekeepers, right, for that curriculum work, because you might have, I don't know, 50 English teachers or 50 teachers who are engaged in ELA work in your school district, and you only have 5 or 10 who are working on those standards, right? Adopting them, understanding them, writing the rubrics for them. And then everyone else is just supposed to take it. But I think that definitely is an assumption, right? That anything my kid does, as on the parent end, right? When you ask my student to do a task, that the things you're asking them to do are actually aligned to the standards or the expectations of the school. And we know that that's not true.
The next one, the context invalidates good assessments. That's really a standardized test. That's a shot at standardized tests, because unless you get everybody in the same room on a Saturday morning at the same time, it's not a valid assessment. So the context of the assessment, so it should, I guess, be context validates or invalidates. But the idea that you have to change the assessment for the context of the kid, that worries people, because then it's not the same assessment for every kid, and how can that be fair if it's not the same assessment for every kid? So if you're taking into account the individual context of the kid, then you're invalidating the assessment. And you're also, I mean, I think you should take into account the context. That's my position. But it does invite bias, because what contexts will a particular teacher decide are important? The contexts that you decide are salient or relevant, um, could be an avenue for bias to enter into the picture.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important here to know that's not on this list is maybe that one assessment task, one day of producing evidence is enough. And that's definitely a falsehood.
Which, if you said that out loud to any teacher, they would say, "Of course, I don't think that's true."
Yeah, but they behave like it is.
Right, which is like the entire premise of these lists.
Yeah. Because we give the SAT, and that for New Hampshire anyway, that's our accountability test, and we say that's the day, that's the test, that's the evidence that our students are learning.
So that leads like into the next one, which good assessments produce a number. That feels like that gets into me in the idea, like you just said, teachers say I have to teach the standards. They also say, well, I have to give a grade. And so the assessment that can boil down to a number is the better assessment. That's the assumption there.
Yeah, folks can't see it if it doesn't have a number, or students don't value it if it doesn't have a number. So I know some teachers who have figured out a way, quite a few, who can talk to their kids, or who do talk to their kids honestly about the purpose of their feedback, mostly writing teachers actually, and I know do this, where they can have conversations about the quality of writing. And I'm not giving you a grade, on this. I'm giving you feedback. And even though the school has to give grades, they can operate quite a bit in that feedback mode for quite a while. But it's definitely a culture that you have to build, right? A lot of schools, are really doing a great job. Vermont has a lot of high schools who have made that switch to proficiency-based reporting, and their students are really talking differently about, what the purpose of their grades are.
Good assessments clearly show you how much a kid has learned. Think maybe I was getting at the how much, like that there this idea that there's a quantity of learning, which I think is crazy. The idea that learning can be divided up into discrete bits that can then be accumulated and computed with, I think is crazy.
Everything is predicated on um, that falsehood that I mentioned earlier, that when you say, or when we say, when folks say assessments or assessment, they're thinking about a one-time experience. And we really need to be thinking about a body of evidence. I mean, I think everybody has to adopt a body of evidence mindset. I mean, really, and not in a way that's my school district where my kids go has an understanding of body of evidence that is just like the body of evidence is all the collection of all the grades. That's what they think competency is. And then I look at all that and all the grades and numbers and I do a computation and that's how I get the grade. But it's not really a body of evidence assessment because they're not looking at all the other things that come in play. We're just sort of nickel and diming things. And we need to be looking at a full picture. And when we nickel and dime things, right, even in capitalism, that idea, we really are shortchanging, no pun intended, the whole, well, humanity. We're shortchanging the humanity of learning.
What about the idea of assessments allowing us to compare kids to one another? I mean, we're strong advocates of not comparing kids to one another.
I think they're used all the time to compare. I mean, we struggle with this with, thinking about growth or even standardized tests, where you look at a school and perhaps every year you have a subset of the population who is not performing at proficiency levels on the test. But every year there's a lot of growth for students. And because they're not at the proficiency level, we ignore the growth. Students should be compared to it's their learning journey. It should be looking, is there growth? They should be compared to themselves, and to look at the expectations of the community. How are they working toward the expectations of the community? We want, as a community, to make sure that our schools are delivering on the promise, that our students are working toward this portrait of the graduate, or whatever you call it, vision of the graduate, these expectations, these standards. Like, our schools should deliver on that promise. And assessment is the way for us to understand that. And then the community's promise is to support schools in delivering that promise through all kinds of different things, mostly tax dollar, right? But other ways as well, moral support and mentors and all of that stuff. So you can't separate assessment from accountability in that way, because the evidence that a community is looking for that their schools are successful will be found in the evidence the students produce of their learning.
I think that aggressive accountability measures can undermine assessment by creating pressure.
Well, because they're not assessing the things that are important to the community. That's the problem. The community might like your list, right? The list here, the community thinks that first thing on your list, the assessments are going to tell you what a kid knows and can do. Well, those standardized assessments don't do that.
Right.
They're dishonest. And even if I believed they could tell you what a student could know or what a student knows, it's a sliver. And you're choosing the sliver
Right.
of what your students are going to be able to show you. So it is a lie. And that's the only thing that our communities look a lot of our communities look for. But our schools can show us all kinds of different ways that our students are being successful, that we can tie to accountability. And I think some states have done this in the past. I know Vermont had a pretty good policy. I thought it was in the early 90s, where students had to have a portfolio, and they had to demonstrate proficiency through that portfolio. That was their state assessment system. It wasn't a standardized test. You can do it, and schools do that all the time, right? How do I know that my students are meeting these expectations, that they can read effectively, write effectively, speak effectively? I have a senior project and an exhibition.
Right.
I'm doing roundtables every year of high school. I have student-led conferences. I'm opening up my school to the community. My students are involved in service learning, and we're talking about that in our community so that they can see what our students are learning in our schools. It's not a hidden thing.
I think one of the problems is that the input into school from the community, which is money, is very quantifiable, but the output, which is learning, is not very quantifiable. And I think we're trying to make quantities out of it. I think that's been ever since they've started giving number grades. We've been trying to make quantities out of learning, and just that shift from going from storytelling to computation feels like it corrupts the process. So assessments can either be summative or formative. I think I'll move that further earlier into the list, but it's obvious, it feels obvious that any assessment can be used formatively or summatively. And depending on how you choose to do it, it's completely up to how the teacher is choosing to use or misuse the information they get.
Yeah, summative assessment is a summation. It's at the end, right? So if you're using traditional school year, you draw the line in June, and that's when you give your summative assessment of what you saw in the learning journey that year. And that assessment should hopefully also be formative and inform what happens the next year on that student's learning journey. I really struggle when folks say, okay, every 4 weeks, and I had to do this in my practice because we had to distinguish things as this is a summative, this is a formative. We had all this crazy stuff, 90-10, where we had to label things as summative and formative. So every 4 weeks you got a summative assessment, but that should not have been summative. That was one piece of evidence along the learning journey.
There's also this idea, though, I mean, there are a lot of hidden assumptions about summative assessment. So and you can see it in the language. This assessment counts is a sign of a summative, as opposed to the other ones not counting. This assessment will be held against you. If it counts, it means it will be held against you. It's part of your permanent record. The whole permanent record thing drives me insane. I can see theoretically the use of summative and formative. I feel like they are misused. And one of the things you said, you draw a line in the sand in June, and it's another one of those things that people say, well, you gotta do grades. It's like, well, you gotta draw a line in the year sometime. So Marzano said that the only reason to do an assessment is to figure out what to do next. Is any other use of an assessment legitimate?
Yeah, because I should use that understanding of our students' learning journey individually. I mean, I'm not reporting out this is Susie's learning journey, this is Johnny's learning journey, but I should be able to understand students' learning journeys and report out to my community in some way, shape, or form how my students are doing in my school. And I don't really think that's too extractive, because that is fulfilling the promise that then my community will then support those learners. So it is a relationship there, but I have to be able to report out to my community something about my students learning
Right.
throughout.
It's completely legitimate for the community to want to know how our schools are doing.
But how are we doing it now? We're reporting on honor roll, we're reporting on college acceptance, we're reporting on maybe student attendance, standardized tests. They're not really important. They can't be understood by the community because they're not meaningful like that.
So I feel like we've come to an end.
We covered them all, yeah.
Covered them all. Do you have any final thoughts about this?
Um, yeah, only that, the first one here, teachers give assessments. I don't think teachers give assessments. I think teachers do assessment. Um, I think teachers give tasks. I think teachers um, create learning activities, but
Hmm.
I don't think they give assessments. They do it.
Right.
Um,
And that's why it's on a list of falsehoods.
oh yes. Okay, I see. I see. I see. I'm getting it. I'm getting it, Gary. I have to like figure out my head backwards here.
And
Uh,
and it's in the language. I'm giving a test today, but and so some people say, well, that's just semantics, and it is semantics, but it's not just semantics. It's like it's semantics that matter.